Well, my task is now to connect all these three lectures and to find a sort of continuum, to recreate a sort of continuum. And the first what comes to my mind is to address the problem of continuum, because in a way, all of you were talking about certain continuums. And I will now formulate 3 questions for each of you with the hope that in answering these questions, we will be able to create some sort of continuum. I'm coming first to what you were concretely, explicitly naming as a continuum of the languages in India before they were, so to say, elevated, into standard languages, which, using this terminology, classical from the sociolinguistic, this is the vernacular continuum, the continuum within the vernacular space. Speaking of resistance, the question is, and your talk was focused on the past, on the experiences of this of past continuum that has been endangered or cut or broken by the modern standardized languages. But I would now, as far as I know, this continuum in India still exists. And just to remind you that, for instance, the originally global digital companies like Twitter, Facebook, and Google addressed in India only an English-speaking audience at the beginning, so that the companies believed that it is impossible to enter this vernacular space. Microsoft, for instance, referred to Hindi as a complex script, meaning too complex to deal with digitally. However, since the mid-2000s, Hindi increasingly becomes the language of digital platforms. But, and I'm just like quoting, with over 4,060 million internet users, a number projected to go up to 635 million by 2021, India is the second largest online market in the world. In India, there are 22 major languages written in 13 different scripts and almost 20,000 dialects. Let's put aside, the logic, how they were counting the languages. But then comes, and speaking of resistance, what is going on now in India is a massive penetration of internet into the non-English speaking audience. This is of huge importance for economy. To put it short, this is a sort of primitive accumulation of capital. The continuum within the vernacular space is sort of like in Britain at the beginning of the capitalism, the meadows, space to be enclosed and included into capitalism. So how do you see translation as a strategy of resistance, precisely looking at the danger of this moment? I will just ask all 3 questions so that we. Lydia, speaking of the just to see, because yes, continuum, you were actually creating the sort of continuum in expanding the idea of language into all the plurality of science. How do you see translation as being capable of deal with this, the notion of science. I mean, you know, just I'm just like I have the problem now. I will come back to your question. Come to the continuum. Sorry. I had an idea, but when it comes to a continuum of the mother tongue, you know, you mentioned Hannah Arendt. Just to tell you just to remind you that Hannah Arendt was in an interview 64. She was asked about her mother tongue, about what is left in her experience dealing with different languages, being a self-translator, so to say. And she asked, her answer was, was ist geblieben? Geblieben ist die Muttersprache. What is interesting, this was translated in English in what was it that continued? My mother tongue continued. So the question is, what is the position of the mother tongue in the concept of this continuity? And speaking of the poetry, she says that I felt a distance toward French and English in German. I know a great number of poems by heart. I will come back to you, just like, please, Ranjit, start to answer the question, and I will come back.
That's my cue to launch into my second lecture of the evening, Boris.
Yes.
No, I'm not going to do that. Let me try and come at your question. You see, what you've drawn our attention to in terms of this kind of entry of digital corporations into India, they're landing at a time when some of these, what I see as linguistic catastrophes, have already taken place. So they're responding, as I see it empirically. I haven't looked at this in great depth, but they still tend to focus very, very strongly on what are called Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities, the big metropolitan centers and the small towns that have become big cities now. Well, linguistic practice is of an interesting hybrid, if you will. I use that word cautiously, kind. And has very strong connections with pan-Indian popular culture. Yeah, so that seems to me the kind of landing point for them. None of this is going to change the prior history from about 1858 to, it's a 100-year history, 1858 literally to about to 1950 that I'm looking at, where these processes of standardization. So let me just restate that, because to me that's the primal scene of our linguistic problems. And I would also be a little cautious about the word vernacular, because what you're looking at in the pre-colonial period is the coexistence of a variety of registers, classical languages, robust vernaculars, languages that work between the classical and vernacular space, and languages, above all, that have mechanisms of accounting for themselves. Yeah, but something happens after the Great Uprising of 1857. Two things happen. One is there's a pedagogical system where a simple Western apparatus comes in. You have the dictionary, you have the grammar, you have ways of arranging. You identify one point, which is usually the power center in every region, and that becomes, like Hanover here, that becomes the standard. And everything else, in comparison, is stigmatized as dialect. Yeah, and that I don't see how this new digital scenario is going to address those problems, because languages stigmatized as dialects already are receding from consciousness. They're not spoken often. Speakers of those languages don't read their literatures. So for me, the problem of translation addresses these crises. So you might well have a new festive popular culture of mixed languages, largely metropolitan, which has digital articulation. That is not going to fix these prior problems. These languages that are vanishing, literatures that are no longer read. And to that extent, I think we are linguistically impoverished. I don't know if this answers your question, Boris, but we may be developing new forms of digital subjectivity, but we are losing things that are now going into the archive. There's a museumization.
Yes, there is the last research in Europe even, the result is that they define, how languages react to digital challenge, so to say, and they found out that 21 of the European languages, although nobody knows how many languages are spoken in Europe, they count languages between 65 and 200, but anyway, they say that 21 of these languages are in danger of digital extinction, won't survive. They are standardized languages. But a month ago, there was an article in CNN about the extinction of languages. So this is another topic. Lydia, of course, I remember the question. And since it was psychoanalysis, this was not the case that I forgot it. I suppressed it. You know why I suppressed it? As a translator of Alfred Lorenzer, who gave for Jürgen Habermas, the idea of translation and psychoanalysis. And my question actually was, I wanted to ask you a very, very German question. Now Habermas will celebrate his 19th anniversary. As you know, for Habermas, this difference between sense and nonsense, and for Alfred Lorenzer, sense and nonsense, speaking of psychoanalysis, is the difference between two languages. Nonsense, epitomized or nonsense within the sickness, is for psychic disorder, is for Habermas a privatized language, alienated language. And the task of psychoanalysis as a communicative translational act, communicative in terms of working together of analyst and the patient, is to make this alienated language public by making sense. So making sense means making it public. This is this classical, very formative concept of both translation, psychoanalysis, sense and nonsense, and it is very, very normative in the political sense. This is so. My question is: you, in expanding this, creating a continuity between sense and nonsense through the digital technology or the experience of this science, you actually create a certain space in which this normative meaning of translation, I'm actually very critical about Habermas' notion of translation, but anyway, this is here, I would say, still, I won't overestimate if I say it's state philosophy of this country. So how shall we deal? Can we deal in a normative sense, but also political sense, with this relation between sense and nonsense?
Do you want to?
Yes,
do you want to
please.
Start, or you want
You can, please, and then.
I really, because of the time limit, I didn't really get into psychoanalysis, although I mentioned Freud. In fact, I thought, what could be more normative than information theory in today's world? And I think you're critical of Habermas. I am also critical of him because I think he got his communication model wrong. Because he got it secondhand. He didn't really read Shannon and cybernetics. He got it from Luhmann. And then Luhmann mixed up language with writing. What I was trying to call attention to was that language was not central to this process. It was letter and number. So I think, as you can see very clearly, digital culture is transforming our practices, primarily at the level of writing, coding, and then how these practices affect languages at the next order. And therefore, I think we need to take information technology seriously, and then there's a way of interpreting Shannon via Freud and also Lacan. I think Lacan gave the most innovative reading of Freud. He reinterpreted Freud through information theory. And this is how I read his seminar in 1954 and 55, the so-called linguistic turn. In fact, it was not a linguistic turn, it was a cybernetic turn. He was talking about information theory. But in any case, so Lacan was most sensitive and he really knew what was going on. And therefore, his contribution was precisely the kind of contribution that you would expect from a psychoanalyst who tried to figure out exactly what happened to the unconscious. The unconscious, we're not talking about something going on in one's head. We're talking about the social and the transformed social realm. That is what people do to their machines, what machines do to people, and what people do to each other through their machines. That's the unconscious. And I think Lacan was the first to point it out.
Thank you. Sigrid.
Yeah, perhaps we should try to somehow connect the different papers. And actually, I'm not so easy with your idea of continuity, because I'm much more dealing with discontinuity, with ruptures, with caesuras, with abyss and the like, with the problems of tradition. And in this respect, I don't answer your, I answer your Arendt question later. I just studied Gershom Scholem a lot and Benjamin. And they have a very interesting idea of tradition, not referring to any content, but to practices of tradition. And in the example of Jewish people, and especially in times of modernization, assimilation, emancipation, and the like, secularization, they very interestingly analyze the way how tradition is handed down in the same time when the content get lost. And this is for me a very interesting example. And the reference of Scholem is writing, scripture, and the rhythm of lament, for example. The rhythm of lament as a kind of a mode of tradition in which the meaning gets deconstructed all the time. So the losing of meaning in each sentence, but in the same time the repetition and the not continuity, but the practice of tradition, not in the sense of information, content, messages, and the like, but as a cultural practice. And I think this, we should think about this a bit more. And you talked on moments in history where new registers are invented, and we exactly experience such a moment at this time when internet technology invents a new standardized language, and we know this will affect many, many different languages, but not only languages, but also thinking, the modes of thinking, behaviors, affects, emotions, and the like. And I think it's interesting that already in Auerbach, when he stayed in Istanbul in exile during Nazi time, he reflected on the concept of world literature, which we like a lot. But he said, in the very moment when world literature will be realized, it's gone, because then it's standardized. So this is a dialectic of globalization, of invention of new languages, where many people today think, oh, wonderful globalized communication, we now all are connected. But in fact, what gets connected are not we, but certain constructs of us. And historical analysis of such caesuras, of dialectics of invention of new languages, registers, and the like, are very important in order to understand what's going on now. And it has not only to do with the psychological unconscious and the unconscious of language, but also the unconscious of technique. And through the unconscious of technique, we are connected, but in a way that works behind our back. So I guess we really have to deal with this, with the historical genealogy of the technique that we are so fond of in the moment. It has to do with cybernetics, with information theory. But as I'm convinced of, is that in the very moment now, we all talk on artificial intelligence. But what we need is an intelligence test for artificial intelligence, because most of the programs are not very intelligent. And this has to do with the inscribed moments, aspects of classification, very old-fashioned ideas of classification, concepts, and the like, which are get installed by the technicians, by computer scientists dealing with topics of psychology and many other things they have no idea about, but they train the programs by not vernacular, but naive and banal ideas of how to distinguish, how to classify, how to analyze. As scholars from the humanities, I think this is the moment where we have to say, wait a moment, with which kind of classification we know this better, because we have analyzed all this for hundreds of years. Hermeneutics, history of concepts, history of metaphors, rhetorics, and the like. So we know how meaning is produced. But now it's not on the surface. And therefore, the problem of translation takes place in all these little mechanisms and operations.
I'm inviting the audience to participate, to take place in. Yes, please. We have here.
Thank you, all three. Thank you. I have a question for Professor Lydia Liu about nonsense and artificial intelligence. You said earlier that maybe adults have a lower tolerance for nonsense, but another way to look at it is that probably adults have a higher tolerance for nonsense with an eye always to like reason of some kind. And it's not like they couldn't function with nonsense, but they try to make it work into a larger paradigm that they can make sense of. And that's the Test? For example, through Catherine Hill's and Luciano Parise's work, we know that any most sophisticated logical systems, including mathematical systems or even Turing's universal machine, there are inherently the uncertain, the unknowable, the illogical factors in it that are not a default, that are not a kind of logical impasse, nor is it some experimental error, but it's inherent in any most sophisticated logical reasoning. And I wonder, and also in the case of artificial intelligence, for example, randomness is built into the mechanisms of learning in machine learning in the form of a matrix, in the form of weights, which is a matrix of real number variables, and they condition computers for them to be able to learn on their own, for them to develop higher and higher levels of logic. And that's where the deep learning comes from. And I wonder, so since randomness is not really the opposite to reason, but it's kind of taking in any kind of higher logical system is inherent to it, and it contributes to it, and it kind of performs a very important function in a kind of higher logical reasoning systems. So it's when it is no longer a kind of childish play, and under the current techno-science condition, how do we think of randomness? Thank you.
Absolutely, randomness is built in because of probability theory. And then, it's not a question of reasoning anymore. I mean, of course, you're working with the computer. You can talk about different levels of reasoning, right? What Shannon was doing was precisely to come up with this mathematical theorem that would handle randomness. Yeah, that's what you get in the information systems. And this is the mathematician's way of dealing with randomness, right? What Freud said about adults' low tolerance for nonsense is in that work that I mentioned, the joke and in its relation to the unconscious. That's something else. It's not related to what we're talking about in terms of, and this is, I brought him up because I wanted to introduce the problem of sense and nonsense into the discussion of translation. It's not related to Shannon's information system. Freud was not talking about probability at all. So these are separate issues.
More questions?
Thank you so much for 3 great talks. Also a question to Lydia. I was actually hoping you would expand a little on what you meant by the theological translation model, on which you didn't get to expand in the beginning. You mentioned the communication model, the hermeneutic model, and what would the theological have been?
Okay. So the theological model, well, a translation theorist, George Snyder's work after Babel, has already done extensive analysis and critique of the theological model. It's a biblical model, and it's basically centered on the problem of meaning, the discovery of meaning, the capture of meaning, or the withdrawal of meaning from us. So that kind of anxiety, basically focused on the plenitude of meaning in translation. So that is the theological model that I was talking about. In contrast to the communication model, which has a reductionist view of language, instrumentalized view, impoverished view. For those of us who are in literature, we know how problematic the communication model of language is. So when we talk about translation, really, there's always a theory of language behind it. Well, I shouldn't go on with a hermeneutic model because I think you can interpret, and it's usually simply derivative of a generalized theory of interpretation. That's the thing I'm trying to get away from.
I just would like to add something, because it depends which religion you are talking about, highly. Because, for example, in Islam, the Quran is somehow taboo for any translation, whereas in Judaism, translation is a cultural tradition because of diaspora and others, and therefore the result was a loss of the scripture, and in modernity some scholars started to retranslate, revive somehow, to try to make it vivid again, the scripture, because it has to be read, and it has to be read in a community and the like. So it really depends on the very religion we are talking.
Certainly not Buddhism, the kind of Buddhist translation, team translation that Ranjit was talking about. No, that's not the theological model at all.
But I was wondering if we often commit ourselves to some notion of another Steinerian term, the real presence in an original, and how do you bear witness to that? Sometimes I think as translators in the practice of translation, we forget I think there's an incredible amount of anxiety that centers on the translated text. And to a certain extent, we tend to forget about all the other apparatus that's available to us. Annotation, commentary, and so on and so forth, which in an expanded way is part of the project of translation. And thank you for drawing that out, the difference among different theologies, different religious traditions. I think in some traditions, people have got around that by claiming, it's a masquerade. You claim that you have a secondary status as a commentator, but you use your annotation and commentary to actually engage with this original without seeming to openly question it. So I think I'm very interested in those occasions in the practice of translation as well. How you mask your motives, how you approach the text, how you pretend a certain reverence but exert criticality. I think there's all that complexity about translation which also we need to bring into play in a discussion like this.
Translation against the author, for example.
Lydia, when we talked earlier with Sima, you mentioned that Benjamin in the task of the translator essay, he would be a good example for this theological model, right?
Yeah, he actually was speaking in relation to that tradition.
Could you develop the idea that a bit further, like Benjamin in this essay as example from
Messianic, like pure language, and you're the author, since you have written on him, and he also used metaphors, right, to talk about this process.
This is a problem of translation, because in German Benjamin says reine Sprache, and it's translated into pure language, but it means mere language. So it's not a theological model, but he talks on the pluralization of languages after Babel. And he, as I quoted, he regards the translation as not a complete praxis in order to deal with the strangeness of languages, but as a kind of relation and activity dealing with the strangeness of language. And he says the translation somehow is the test for the distance of all the languages to what's Offenbarung?
Revelation.
Revelation. So, and revelation is another term for mere contact without signs and the like. So the distance from this kind of pure mere revelation has to do with the history of languages. So his reference in the essay is mainly to the history of languages and how languages change through history and get in stronger distance to each other.
I have a question with regard to a comment you made about the question about surfaces and the way that we're thinking of meaning. And I only say it because I think in terms of the way that we're talking about, say, minor literatures and minority as a way of creating particular idiomatics or rhizomatics of it at least, wouldn't you think that memes, for instance, or say GIFs in the way that they exist on the internet, give in to creating a rhizomatic of an idiom, and that particular surface, that is plied upon and upon to the point that memes become more self-referential, is then also underscores the attributive nature of meaning. And which is why AI, in many ways, is, I understand that AI is not intelligent in terms of, say, intellection of ideas, but it's probably intelligent in the way that Amazon uses to, like, deliver everything in terms of, say, Prime Day customers. You get it within it. And so that particular classification of time and space in the way that AI puts our orders makes no meaning to us at all. But it makes perfect ideas in terms of efficiency. And so that is probably one way of thinking of meaning, and the way that that particular thing is changing, not just on the internet as a behavioral thing in terms of memes and GIFs, but also the way that we are using the internet in order to, say, use Amazon, to use a very terrible example.
No, I wouldn't distinguish meaning and nonsense, or sense and nonsense, because I'm interested in the way meaning is produced and what kind of meaning. And I think there is no non-meaning, but there is always a meaning produced, but it's different. And we have to address which kind of meaning. And you selected a brilliant example. I mean, the meaning of using Google means an individualized access to information. That's the meaning. And it makes a certain sense. Whether it makes sense for me is another question, but it makes sense for advertisement and other things.
Well, actually, Shannon categorically denies that information is about meaning. Okay, so I think there's a misunderstanding here. And so he repeatedly rejects the idea that information or message has content. All right. So this is the basics, the foundation of information theory. It has to raise some question. We can't use our own anthropocentric notion of meaning. Look, we're faced with a lot of things, uncertainties. And then the fact that we desperately search for meaning says something about where we are. So this is where we differ.
I think it's already too late. You are hungry and probably thirsty. Thank you for your talks. Thank you for the discussion, and thank you for all the audience for participating in our discussion. Thank you very much.